So speaking earlier about a shift in gear that can happen, and I mentioned that we'd do the odd little exploration or meditation, which sometimes is much shorter than I think because I start speaking. But often we're not necessarily familiar with what life experience is, prompted by specific pointers. So if we acknowledge that life is always happening right now, it's never really happened anywhere else other than now. So if we think about something that happened a year ago, that's a memory that's happening now, a memory of something that apparently happened before, but when it actually was happening, let's say we were blowing out candles on a birthday cake, the actual event was happening right now at the time. So life is always only ever happening in this very small window, what we could call the present moment, the now. And in practice, it doesn't ever exist except for the now. And so bringing our attention onto what's here now can sometimes be, an eye-opener. And what tends to take us away from being present with what is now is the thinking about the past and the future, and the blame and the guilt of how we should be and how the other should be. So there's a whole layer of thinking that attracts our attention up into the thinking. And so what we'll do now is we'll explore the present moment experience a little bit. Become familiar with what is here now. So I talk about life experience, the experience of life. What is experience in the sense I'm speaking about? It's not, I had a wonderful experience when I was riding on the roller coaster. That we tend to refer to experience sometimes as being peaks and troughs. It was a very tough experience or a very great experience. Whereas actually, it's all experience. What's happening right now is experience. And what constitutes the experience is, by and large, the visual component of the experience. So just becoming aware of the visual component of the present moment experience means we're becoming present with life experience. So that means to bring attention to a particular object and realize that that is part of the visual field, part of the what we can call the visual component of the present moment experience. And instead of just bringing it to one particular object, it's helpful to open up the gaze, meaning just allow the gaze to be soft and not focused on anything in particular. And realize that the full visual experience arises in our field of awareness. And we're not necessarily able to see the periphery of the experience in any great detail, but we get a sense that there's something there. So we can be looking and we can see the ceiling, we can see the floor, we can see the whole vista. And if we want, the head can move. And there isn't really a job to do, just recognizing the visual aspects of the experience. Life is collaborating, and is introducing some sound elements to the experience that aren't normally there. So thunder is part of the life experience when it happens. My voice is a component in the present moment experience that you are having. So we each know our own experience of life. We can't know what the other's experience of life is, but we can know our experience of life. What earlier I was referring to as personal consciousness. Experience from the perspective, it seems, of a particular human being. And then there are some smaller components to the experience, like smell, touch, or smell and taste. And then touch can be a large part of the experience in certain experiences. So if you're having a massage, for example, and you become aware of the present moment experience, then the sense of touch is a bigger component of the experience than at a time when you might be sitting very still. And at that time, the visual experience, and maybe sound, if there's dogs barking or thunder happening or someone speaking, then the sound is part of the experience. So in doing this exploration, where we don't really have a job to do at controlling what the experience is, we're really just bringing our attention onto what life experience is. What is life experience? It's the experience arising right now. So I've been speaking about what seem to be external experiences of visual and sound. There are also other components like thought and feeling and emotions. They are also part of the overall experience in the present moment. And in having our gaze open and soft, not focusing on anything in particular, we can also maybe allow the center of consciousness to drift down to the chest area. It's very used to remaining up in the head, where we tend to be thinking about a lot of things and judging and analyzing. And so for this exercise, we can just let the center of consciousness drift down into the chest area, as if it's being dragged down by gravity. It's actually being dragged down into the home of consciousness. And as the center of consciousness drifts down into the chest, we might start to get a sense, especially if our field of vision is a soft gaze, we might start to get the sense that we are aware of the present moment experience from a different perspective or a different place, a different location than we're used to. We might even drop the notion that the experience is being registered by the body. We might come to see that the body is just a component of the overall experience. So the hands or the legs are part of the visual field. And that sound, maybe of the body breathing or external sounds, my voice, are all part of the overall vista. And your own body is not the subject, but just an object in the experience field, not separate from the experience, part of the experience. And if you close your eyes, then what you'll notice is that in an instant, the whole experience has changed radically. So instead of us just saying, oh, I just closed my eyes, if we're really present with the experience as it's presenting itself, from one moment to the other, the experience is radically different. And so if you open your eyes again, the experience changes radically. The world, what we can call daily living, spontaneously arises where previously there was nothing visual, for example. And so you can experiment quite easily and see how radically and spontaneously the experience of life can change. And if thinking is happening, then the thinking is just a component in the life experience. It's a less tangible component. But if we start to see that the sight, the sound, the smell, the taste are just different types of components, then thought and feelings, intuition, emotions are all components that are added in to create the overall experience in each moment. And you'll notice that certain components create the impression of the world in which we live in. So if we're really present with the experience when there is no visual field, or no visual component, then we see, oh, well, there is no daily life. If we are just sitting still, and there's no body, there's no external world, which is primarily comes into existence because of the visual field or because of a sense of spaciousness, because we can feel our body moving in space. So if the experience is lacking those components, then if we let go of any residual self-image or residual image of what the world is and where we are, and remain really present with the experience, we say, oh, daily living isn't really here. And if we let go of the beliefs about where the sounds are coming from and what they imply. So if there is the sound of a dog barking or a bird chirping or a man shouting or a car honking, and we just treat it as a sound arising in consciousness, not necessarily defining an inside and an outside, which is what automatically happens if we're convinced that the body is the subject. So now the sense of inside and outside may have fallen away. So any sound that is recognized is arising as part of the momentary experience, and it's all contained within, never outside of what is aware. If something is outside of what is aware, then it's fair to say it's not part of the experience. So the thunderclap happens inside what we are. It doesn't come from outside. It arises inside the awareness. And if you open what we call opening the eyes, the whole daily living experience suddenly appears in the space that was previously a different experience. What we might become aware of is the fact that there's something very intrinsic, something very fundamental to experience, and that is the faculty or the functioning of awareness, and maybe a little bit more subtle, the sense of existence. The faculty of awareness is something that's ever present in experience, is necessary in order for experience to be here, and yet it's often underappreciated, unrecognized, not known to be here, not known to be fundamental to experience. Whether it's an experience of duality or experience of oneness doesn't really matter. That's just the different makeup of the components, and different positioning of components to create a different type of experience. But fundamentally, experience is experience. The background of experience is awareness, or fundamental, so we won't use the words too rigidly. When I say background, it can be known to be all-pervasive through the experience, and that the objects of experience come and go, are always changing. So opening and closing your eyes is a very interesting way to see the content of the experience change radically, very quickly. And yet awareness is there, that registers whatever makes up the experience in the moment. And the idea that awareness belongs to the body in this particular exploration doesn't need to hang around. We could look at the awareness as being much more the subject than the body is. That the awareness is present even when the experience of the body has largely fallen away. And inherent in this awareness is another basic component of consciousness. So we could say that all there is consciousness. And the two basic components of consciousness are the function of awareness and the sense of existence. So if all there is consciousness, it really means that essentially experience is consciousness. But in more practical terms, the two basic components of consciousness are awareness and the sense of existence. So how do we know this sense of existence is here? What is it that's being spoken about? It too, like the awareness, is so ever present that a recognition of it might not be there. It's sometimes difficult to recognize something that doesn't have a contrast. So if the awareness and the sense of existence are always present in experience, they may become taken for granted. unrecognized. They might be so fundamental, they might be the most important part, and yet unrecognized. So what is the sense of existence I'm speaking of? It's a perfume in a sense that pervades the experience. Often it pervades the experience in such a way that it feels like it's intrinsic to the body. When we sit and the experience is one of there being, let's say, no visuals of the body and there's not much movement, so the sense of touch fades away. Then the sense of existence permeates the experience but isn't appearing as if it's central to the body. And still you might be saying, what's the sense of existence you're talking about? So if I pose the question, are you dead? Then the experience itself answers the question. We don't need to think about it. The answer is self-evident. I am. As in, not I am dead, but I exist. I am not dead. I exist. I am. And that I amness, which is so often taken to be I am the body, in an exploration of experience, in what we could say a meditation, can present itself as being something much more fundamental to experience than fundamental to the body. And simple awareness of one's own existence, not one's own existence as a human being, but just the undeniable sense of impersonal existence, is something that we can rest in. What is it that exists? Well, the sense I exist doesn't tell us what exists. It doesn't tell us where it comes from. But what is undeniable is I am. If we open our eyes and the daily life experience presents itself again, we may notice that the awareness and the sense of existence are still components of the experience. But now they're amongst a more complex version of experience. So to the extent that we can find ourselves resting in this sense of, or this awareness and sense of existence, then the more likely it is that that resting can happen as we move through life. And so sitting every now and again and being present with the experience, finding what we call eyes closing happening from time to time. And then a presence with the experience as it is now, so bringing attention to what we could call the back of the eyelids and realizing, oh wow, look, there's this vast open space. That is the formless space, and that the sense of awareness is pervading that. The sense of existence pervades that. And the more complex experience of life fits into that space, arises in that space. So becoming aware of the sense of existence and the awareness that is aware might be the revelation of the core of the human being. It might be coming in contact with the aspects of consciousness that are the first expressions of the impersonal consciousness that have linked and identified to a particular body-mind and are functioning through that body-mind as the Roger experience or the John experience. So when we come in touch with the awareness and being, then those two components may well be the initial components that are part and parcel or come with the impersonal consciousness. And then the more complex versions that layer on top of that, the personality, the age, the gender, add to the personalness of the experience. And so if we only know the extremities, if we only know the personality, the characteristic, without becoming familiar with the very core, the awareness and the sense of existence, then it's fair to say that we only know ourselves in a limited way. And if we come to know ourselves only at the core, and then disregard the more personal aspects of the person, the personality and the age and the gender, then once again we could say maybe we only know a part of ourselves. So to come to know the full expression and not include and exclude, but to see it all as part and parcel of the human experience. And if we then see that what is a momentary experience in practical terms, when we're not doing this exploration, which is specifically focusing on the life experience, it unfolds as if the world is an objective reality. So the experience is present in each moment in such a way that seems to confirm or seems to suggest that life is an objective reality, not just an experience arising in consciousness. And so we can live it that way. We don't need to go around saying that this is all an illusion, that it's not real. It may, from some fundamental perspective, be that that's the case, just a dream arising in consciousness. Yet that's not where the dream is to be lived from. That might be part of coming to see the nature of life. But the nature of life also includes the very practical expression of it, the experience of it, and that is that if you were to drop a chair on your head, the experience is that it's a real chair falling on a real body, and so we have to live as if it's real. Maybe it is real. In fact, from a practical point of view, I'd say it tells me it's much more real than it's not real. And living as if it's real, which isn't living pretending it's real. It's that we find that the movement, when we stop saying it's real or unreal, the movement is that the body carries on like it's just a human being in an objective world. It doesn't have any questions about real or unreal. It, hears the doorbell and it opens the door. It feels hunger and it looks for food. We might actually come to see that we've become convinced it's unreal based on some explorations that we've done that showed us from one perspective it could be seen to be less real. From one perspective, the whole experience arises and in an instant it can radically change. But that's not conclusive proof that it's not real. Just like the fact that because it feels like a chair falls on your head and it feels real isn't conclusive proof that it is real. in a dream at night, the dream character spontaneously arises out of nothing. In the dream world, the whole dream world arises out of nothing, and it's experienced to be absolutely real. And in an instant, from the outside perspective where we understand a dream arising out of nothing and essentially just collapsing at the end of it, and the whole dream world collapses, the character in the dream that from within the dream felt itself to be completely real, collapsed with the whole world, and it's clear that nothing ever happened. It was all just an imagination. So the fact that this feels very real is not necessarily proof that it's real. So we don't know if it's real or it's not real. And that's not important. We don't need to know whether it's real or it's not real. What we need to know is what we're looking for in life, which is happiness in daily living for the human being. So if we become clear that the dream or the reality is here, and that in this dream or in this objective reality, whichever one it is, I don't know, it presents as if it's an objective reality. Now I just have to get on with living my life. In fact, I find that life gets lived through me. And if there's any question, then the question is, what am I really looking for in this, whatever it is? I just like it to be such that I'm comfortable with this. And so then we go back to the explanations that say the uncomfortableness arises when we have a certain attitude to what happens in life. So life is, whether it's the dream or whether it's an objective reality, we don't know. Who cares? We find that our uncomfortableness is when life, the dream or the reality, is unfolding, and we have an attitude towards what is happening that is an attitude of doership and attachment to outcomes. Now that attitude is, on the one hand, there because if it's a dream, because it was put there as part of the creation. And if it's much more of an objective reality that unfolds according to cause and effect and evolution, like appears to be what all of the signs indicate, then we can say that the attitude of doership and attachment to outcome is there because evolution has put it into place. So from either perspective, we start to see that if the attitude of doership is there, it's there because it's destined to be there. Not my doing, but a happening. And that doesn't apply just for the attitude of doership, it applies for the feelings that we have on a circumstantial level, the biological reactions that we have. They're all part and parcel of what is. To the extent that this gets realized in a particular moment, it's either because it's a dream, because it's part of the dream, or an objective reality. When the realization happens that everything is just happening automatically, then we can't deny that what is happening on the surface is a story of causality, cause and effect. We don't suddenly have a tree pop into existence in the middle of the lounge room. Trees pop into existence in gardens where seeds have been planted and water has been applied and sunshine, and a tree appears. So the story of life brings things into appearance the story of life unfolds as if it's a story of cause and effect. And so our peace doesn't just magically happen. It happens as part of a process of cause and effect. And so if there is a realization in a particular moment that life is happening, that I'm not the one in control of it, I'm not the one in control of my personality and the way I function, and I'm not in control of my attitude, then a relaxation on some level happens with it, cause and effect. So the relaxation, the peace, is causal. It's a result of a process that comes before. It wouldn't make sense for us to just be at peace with no reason. Or, sorry, not with no reason, but with no rationale. If life has deeply ingrained a belief structure that prevents us from being at peace, if life has deeply ingrained a belief structure that gets triggered by outcomes time and time again, it means that's in place. So it wouldn't make sense for life to suddenly then create no suffering. It would make sense for life to deliver causes that lead to the effect of no suffering, because this is a story of cause and effect. And that's why someone might argue, but this time and space don't really exist, cause and effect don't really, everything is spontaneously arising right now. If we look at what is spontaneously arising right now, the story that is spontaneously arising right now is always a story of causality. We don't get things in the story that are there without a causal explanation. Pictures are not on the wall without cause. A handyman in the story, in the history of the story, a handyman came and drilled holes in the wall and stuck screws in there, and the pictures are then, and the ones that aren't hanging up are not hanging up because the cause for them to hang up hasn't happened yet. And so these little details sometimes are missed. Is that when someone says time and space are the problem, or time is the problem, that causality is not how we function in life. When liberation happens, we just need to observe the movement or ask a person that has seen through certain misunderstanding and ask them, what about in your experience, does memory still arise? And I think you'll find the answer is yes, memory does arise. And so memory and the past is not a result of misunderstanding. That when the misunderstanding falls away, the experience still includes an apparent past that isn't created by misunderstanding. It's created by a spontaneous arising of a component in the experience which we call memory, an experience that even the liberated person still has. And so the experience after this liberation is not an experience of no time. Time is brought in simply by the arising of objects that create contrast. And another way of saying it is by a functioning of the brain that remembers. So I was very lucky to have an injury or an illness that you could say was a type of brain damage. And it showed me, one of the symptoms showed me how subtle and what with different forms memory can come in. What I found is that I wasn't able to drive very well because my short-term memory was affected. And I'm not talking about remembering someone's phone number. I'm talking about pulling out onto a road from a side road and sitting at the side road needing to look left and right, see that there's no cars coming. I get confused when telling this story because I drive on the left side of the road, not in a country where you drive on the right. But but the principle's the same. You have to look both ways before you pull out onto the main road. And with this injury, I'd look one way, and it's clear. Look this way, but then I forget what I saw on this side. And so I'd be doing this. And so I had to come up with a system that's okay, so you look to the left first, let's say, and if it's clear for a long time, then you look to the right. And so then if I'm looking to the right, then I know it's because it was clear on the left. And so then I can trust myself and pull out, which normally when the faculty of memory is working, that is not something you have to have a system for, because you look one way and you then look this way and you remember. So you said we don't think of memory as being this fine, this short term. We assume that I know what was on the left when I'm looking to the right, not because of memory, but because, well, we assume it's because of something else. It's actually because of the faculty of memory. And if that gets taken away, you realize, oh, it requires memory to remember what was seen a second before. And so memory is not an error. You can't function without memory. You would see someone that you know and you'd have no idea you know them. So memory is not the error. The story of life, and it's not memory, time is not the problem. Life is designed to be an experience of time and space, of cause and effect. So we don't need to wait for the illusion of time to dissolve. The attachment to the past and the expectation of the future is different. That is an attachment to the past and future, and the past and future being time. Now, we don't need time to dissolve in order for the attachment to time to dissolve. Just like the love of money is the root of all evil, is one of the sayings in the Bible. And we tend to be a bit lazy and we say money is the root of all evil. It's not money, it's the love of money. So it's the attachment, the love of, meaning the attachment to it is the problem. So when the attachment falls away, the practical benefit of pleasure and pain will still be there, but our attitude to it is very different. And in the same way, the attachment to the past and attachment to the future is something very specific. It's our attachment to time. Not time itself. Time itself is no problem. In fact, I'd have to say that this is an experience of time and space, and that's not going anywhere.
So I've heard you say with Ramesh, for a while you went through a phase where you kept wanting to like take his words and put them in your own words, and I haven't done that a whole lot, but there's one particular point of the teaching where it just, every time I hear it, I keep wanting to tweak the language. And it's going off the meditation we did starting this round. So there's the impersonal consciousness, and that comes into this impersonal body-mind, and the result is Clint. But the combination of those two things, I think, is Clint, like, in a functional sense, but you keep wanting to, like, no. The teaching is presented as if the combination of the two is personal consciousness. And every time I hear that, I feel my body resist it, because it feels like, yeah, practically it's Clint asking Roger a question, but, you know, the body-mind's impersonal, the consciousness is impersonal, they combine, and the result is something unique. It's different from other things. But the word personal, for some reason, always, like puts me into the personal doer. Like, I keep wanting to get that out, you know, every time I hear you saying that the combination of the two is a personal consciousness, and I get stuck there, because that feels like the same thing as personal doer. What the illusion is, that there's some, you know what I'm trying to say? I just get tripped up on that.
It could be a case of sort of throwing the baby out with the bathwater, because if we only know the personal, if we only know Clint as the doer, if we only know Clint in the form where the belief in doership is heavily ingrained, then knowing ourselves as Clint is uncomfortable. If we only know ourselves, whenever we know Clint, if we find that the belief in personal doership and attachment to outcomes is there, then when we know ourselves as Clint, it's uncomfortable. And if we find ourselves doing some practice or activity that we find we enjoy, and let's say that's a meditation, and when that happens and it becomes much less personal, the Clintness disappears. And in a way, we zone out of Clint, and we're much more in the impersonal. And there can be this, what a relief. And that can actually be called awakening, where there is a recognition of the impersonal component. When I say the impersonal, it isn't really impersonal. It's an impersonal version of personal consciousness. So the zoning out is still personal consciousness, when it's just it feels impersonal, an impersonal version of personal consciousness. And when that happens, so let's say you're just watching a sunset and you dissolve, in a sense, into the sunset, and there's no thinker, and even the body that is meant to be there watching the sunset has dissolved, in a sense. The experience is just being absorbed in the experience of sunset. You're on? And it can be such a relief. It's like, why doesn't this, what a gift to not be the person. And so then we start to become convinced that the person is the problem. The personal is the problem. And we find that there's this other place of zoning out that, relative to zoning in, is like freedom. And so we've heard a lot about freedom and the seeking for freedom, the search for freedom, and that the core of what we are is impersonal, and that the problem is separation, the problem is thinking you're a person, all sorts of things that then affirm what this shift is telling us, that the problem is the person. And when I'm impersonal, everything's okay. When I'm impersonal, life isn't personal. When I'm not Clint, everything is fine. And then you come back to being Clint, and it can be, oh, here I am again. I'm just waiting for life to be a problem. Or you don't even need to wait for life. You might just come back and it already is a problem. Oh, I'm back. But maybe that uncomfortableness isn't fundamental to Clintness. Maybe that problem is fundamental to a component of Clintness that gets transcended when we transcend Clint. If we transcend Clint, then the problem part is also transcended. Now the trick is to come back into Clint and find ourselves being able to transcend the problem part of Clint, and yet be very much but the other part of Clint being there.
So, I mean, when I come back, and if I'm very present with the teaching, there's no thinker and there's no doer. There's kind of a witness slipping more comfortably into the body-mind as it's kind of designed to happen. But so you're saying there's still a Clintness there?
Sure. I mean, the more that there is witnessing, the more we feel like we're not Clint. So the body can be doing its thing, and then there's a witnessing of the body doing its thing. And what I mean by the witnessing is not there is a witness, but there is just witnessing, the seeing or the watching, but not by Clint, by something beyond Clint. Well, what seems like it's beyond Clint. And so then you would say, well, it doesn't even feel like there is Clint there. There's just the body functioning. But these are all movements, phases, let's say. And so witnessing can then transition again, such that the witnessing is not necessarily out there anymore. And then it's like, oh, I'm Clint. I'm not witnessing from out there. I'm not witnessing Clint functioning. I'm back into Clint. And by then, the problem might have dissolved. So we come back and find ourselves being Clint with no problem.
Right. Yeah, it's hard to separate myself from the thinker and the doer, I guess. Yeah. It is kind of funny.
Who's on third?
Yeah. But it is It is very strange, you know, the personal and the impersonal. So
Yeah, I know what you mean, because I was convinced that there is no Roger, and maybe, you know, people have suggested that, oh, he just, you know, came back and didn't really go all the way. Who cares? I don't, because there's no suffering. So if the journey is so much more than just the end of suffering, let's say, well, maybe, and I guess that will happen when it's going to happen, if it's going to happen. But in the meantime, it's not important. There's no issue with this. So I have no question. I just don't want to be rude if someone puts that notion forward. But internally, there's just no question that actually all we're looking for is the end of suffering. And when that's delivered, there's no seeking. There's no caring about whether there's eternal bliss available around the corner. It's like, oh, well, if it is available around the corner, when round the corner is not round the corner anymore, I'm going to have it. But until then, there's no seeking for it, no seeking for anything. And then that's not conceptual, that's resting in a way of being in life, which is really simple, just no suffering. And then the feedback is, no suffering means no expectation, no wanting life to be different, no need for it to be different, because it's fulfilling. And the fulfilling is not necessarily something that we might imagine. It's not being plugged into some gold stream or some stream of gold light that is coming in and warming me from the inside, as though, you know, and that's the fulfilling. It's ironically something very paradoxical. It's fulfillment is the absence of non-fulfillment. It's the removal of non-fulfillment, and then we call it I'm fulfilled, and so then the thinking mind says, oh, fulfilled, I wonder what that feels like. I wonder how I'm going to feel when I feel fulfilled. Because the wording filled, right? Full and filled. So given that it's not the gaining of anything, it seems strange that the word is fulfilled. But it is. Same as acceptance. All of these things are the negation, the absence of acceptance is the absence of non-acceptance. Fulfillment is the absence of non-fulfillment. Peace is the absence of suffering. That's why in the Buddha often describe things in their negative form, because it's more accurate, rather than in the positive form. So if we talk about contentment, it seems like, well, what do I get? What is there when I'm content? And so he says, to avoid that confusion, let me just say that contentment is just the absence of non-contentment, so describing it in its negative form. Did you have a question?
Out the window.
I have a question about like that your happiness is not to be found in outcomes, because for me, I think like the understanding of non-doership has sinking as deep as like it's given me like so much less suffering, and I'm pretty happy and everything, but I still feel like a lot of my happiness does come from outcomes. And of course I understand that your happiness is really to be found in your attitude to the flow of life, and when you like have an understanding that like your flow of life is not really in your control, then you can chill and it's pretty nice. But still I feel like just that teaching says that your happiness is not to be found in outcomes, and how can that be correct when, you know, there are still like big stuff that like you do in a life, like for example having a child, like your big love, like big stuff in life, and that is like outcomes, but it's also happiness. What are your...
Or it's pleasure.
But it's still like...
it's
still something that makes life richer.
Yeah, pleasure is on the flow of life. There is only pleasure or pain. So we can't say that pleasure and pain or outcomes are not a significant part of life. So feelings of love, for example, are part of what I would put in the spectrum of pleasure and pain. So it's not, by calling it pleasure or pain, we're not reducing love and the feelings of love, let's say, down to something insignificant. It still is a feeling of love which has very amazing depth to it. So the flow of life or circumstance still has a lot of depth to it. And the peace and the flow of life never actually exist independent of each other. They, you know, when you're at peace, there is also the flow of life present. So maybe what happens is that we find ourselves at peace regardless of circumstance, or happy regardless of circumstance, and yet circumstance is always there. And so some circumstance is very fortunate and pleasurable. So we find ourselves happy and experiencing pleasure, and we might mistake our happiness for the pleasure. And then, if that's the case, it's worthwhile noticing that when the pleasure turns into pain, we may find ourselves still at peace, but with circumstance being painful. And then it turns back into pleasure, and we see, oh, now life is pleasurable, and I was thinking that my happiness was the pleasure. But actually my happiness is the peace. And then the pleasure is something great. So this doesn't mean that we have to start using... so I would still say, oh, I'm very happy to see you. If someone I haven't seen and I'm very fond of, and I'm so happy to see you. It's using the word out of context to how it's used in the teaching. What it really means, I'm so pleased to see you. It's so pleasing, it's so pleasurable to see you. And it's okay to, once we know what we mean inside, then we can say, I'm so happy to meet you. If we want to be particular, we can say, oh, I'm so pleased to see you. It's such a pleasure to see you. That really means you see someone and it's like, ooh, great. You know, there's a feeling there, and that's part of the depth of life. Now, is that my happiness? Or that excitement? That excitement, is that my happiness, or is that pleasure? So I would say it's pleasure. And my happiness was there before that exciting feeling. Much more subtle happiness. And so I would agree that pleasure is a great part of life. And we could say that having a child was the most pleasurable thing in my life. We probably wouldn't say that all the time, especially hearing someone at childbirth. So there's no doubt that we could say having a child is a very enriching part of life, a very important or depth. But is it where someone's happiness stems from? I'd say it's where the richness of life, a certain part of richness of life can stem from. But so this really comes down to the fundamental thing. Do we really believe that our happiness, our peace of mind, is not to be found in circumstance? So your question is like sort of questioning that and saying, how does it all fit together? Or this is the way I see it. And the teaching is emphatic that says really your peace of mind is not dependent on outcomes, not dependent on circumstance, meaning that when we find happiness in the form of peace of mind, we can find it present even when circumstance is not in in our favor. Yeah. And it really is let me so it really is sometimes hard to see the subtleties. If you do, let's say, a Tantra weekend, a workshop, a Tantra workshop, and you've never done Tantra workshops before, and they do certain exercises where you, intimate with another person, not necessarily in a sexual way, but you're really open and expressive, and you express different things as guided by the workshop facilitator. And let's say it then even does become physically intimate. And there's this feeling that comes through you in that moment that feels amazing, like really something you haven't felt in relating to someone for a long time or ever maybe. And you, in that moment, you feel this is completely available. And you're exhilarated by the intimacy and even maybe some sexual feelings and connection to the other. And so that's a part of pleasure. A part of pleasure that's there because we're also very present. And then we can think, oh, this is it. This is what I've been looking for. Which is the danger of some spiritual paths, that some spiritual paths deliver a lot of pleasurable experience. So psychedelic or paths that include, I don't know what you call them, psychedelics, let's say, or drugs or medicine, or, are very profound, but they also include part and parcel in them a lot of experiential components that can be radically new and be very profound. And the subtlety between the experience and the actual peace that we're really looking for can be lost. And so we become convinced, oh, that's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for a relationship with someone that feels like I felt in that exercise. And that exercise was not necessarily what's the feeling you had in that exercise is not necessarily something that is continuously available to us on an unbroken basis. And one of the big problems is that we come to think that that's what we're looking for, that we're looking for bliss on a continuous, unbroken basis. So we have these feelings from time to time. Just an unexplainable sense of universal love or bliss comes over us, and then we think, this is my true nature. This is what one day I will find myself immersed in forever. And it's in my experience, it's not what is needed in order for us to say, I'm happy.
I'm afraid of negative outcomes, though, because I'm afraid that if life presents negative outcome after negative after negative after negative, and worse and worse and worse, and I lose the peace of mind. So, which makes, do you have anything you can say on that? Because life could,
Sure,
it's possible, that just horrible stuff is going to happen, and then, when life is easy, now life is easy, it's easy to feel peaceful, but maybe it's not easy when life is terrible.
It's not at all easy when life is terrible if attachment to outcome is there. But it's not easy to feel comfortable in life even when life is pleasurable when attachment to outcome is there. Because attachment to outcome isn't... So our resistance doesn't only happen when life delivers negative outcomes. When there is the false sense of identity, we can find ourselves in quite favorable circumstance and still feel unfulfilled, uncomfortable, because there's this false idea of who we are that by default feels uncomfortable. So it's not only painful situations that create an uncomfortableness. So if we're feeling okay in the face of pleasure, especially for an extended period of time, then there's a likelihood that it's not just feeling okay because of pleasurable circumstance. That it's something more fundamental. It's maybe a comfortableness due to the dissolving of the mistaken ideas of who we are. And yet, we might still be at a point where we can't really understand how this is happening, and so in our head there's this fantasy, if this negative situation happens, then it's going to blow me out of the water. And I remember, I don't know if I'll tell the story, I remember one time my circumstance was quite favorable, and I remember thinking that if the favorable circumstance were to change, my life wouldn't really be worth living. That was a thought that happened while I was walking around the park contemplating. It was a financial thing that had happened. 6 months later, that circumstance had changed radically, and it couldn't be much worse, basically. And I found myself walking around the same park thinking, it has no effect on me. What I thought would be basically the end of my happiness, in practice, had no effect on the happiness I felt. So that circumstantial situation got extracted out very dramatically. And I found myself in the face of fairly extremely negative circumstance, completely connected, and thinking, wow, I thought that my happiness back then was dependent on my circumstance. My circumstances changed radically. My understanding hadn't changed radically in that 6 months. It was the same. But that event became a very significant part of the deepening of the understanding, where the deepening of the understanding was, oh, my happiness isn't dependent on circumstance. Whereas previously, the happiness I had wasn't dependent on circumstance, but I thought it was. So maybe you'll be surprised if some unfortunate things happen. They might not be as bad as you think.
I kind of think of it, I guess I'll hold it down, a difference between peace and happiness. And peace to me seems like a place I'd rather be than in happiness. Is there, and maybe that's because I'm not as evolved as you are. Like if I had and I know I'm not looking for a destination, it's a process, but they're two different things to me, happiness and peace.
Okay, so our usual definition of happiness is outcome driven. So happiness, usually our definition of it is when we're excited, when we're looking forward to going on holiday or things are going well, and there's a feeling about the good things that are happening. And that tends to be what we think of happiness. And as I mentioned at the beginning, we are looking for happiness, but happiness isn't what we think it is. It's not to be found in outcomes. It's not a feeling of excitement or a feeling of joy. And so when I use the word happiness, people sort of automatically revert to their definition of happiness. The definition here is, but happiness is peace of mind.
Okay. So we're kind of redefining, I can't get it to work. Redefining happiness.
Yes.
Okay.
So
okay.
Essentially, happiness and peace of mind are interchangeable.
Okay.
I use the word happiness because it's a much more practical explanation, as long as we don't hold on to our old definition of it. It's like, actually, I'm just looking to be happy in life, but what does that mean? What does it look like? And it looks like peace of mind.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. And the peace of mind piece would be what I would be striving for. So,
The peace of mind
not
is...
striving for, but
No, but if we asked ourselves, what are we really looking for?
right, looking for.
The answer is peace of mind.
Right. Okay.
The answer is also happiness, because the two things equate.
interchangeable.
Yeah. But it might be worthwhile, so I'll repeat it for the recording as well. Whenever I say happiness, I mean peace of mind. Yeah.
And I do agree that peace of mind is a wonderful thing, and it's what I really look for, but continual bliss wouldn't be all that bad either.
You'd be surprised, because what will happen is it becomes very normal after a while, and then you'd need an even stronger bliss to satisfy you. Because that's the thing with flow of life. It's one of the beauties of the flow of life being duality, is that there is the benefit of contrast. And peace of mind is something outside of the flow of duality, so there doesn't need a contrast. You don't need suffering to keep coming in order for you to appreciate peace of mind. But if it came to pleasure, pleasure's on a different spectrum. And so if we had continuous pleasure, it becomes normalized very quickly. It's nice to have bliss every now and again. Just like chocolate cake.
I think you're saying that you no longer, if you attain something that's pleasurable, you no longer worry about losing it. Is that what I'm hearing from you?
That becomes part of the peace as well. Because ordinarily, if we attain something pleasurable, we're simultaneously worried about losing it.
Right.
Because we believe that it's more than just pleasure, it's part of what is delivering completeness. And so, if you're on holiday, on day 7 of your 10-day holiday, you start, oh no, I've got to go back soon, and all this work to do. And so the last 3 days of your holiday is actually disturbed by the fear that it's coming to an end. So the not holding on to it with mental stories about what will happen when it's not there means we get to appreciate, get to enjoy it fully in peace. So to elaborate, there's a story you might have heard in some of the scriptures, the Indian scriptures. The unenlightened person is referred to as a bogey, an enjoyer of pleasure. And the enlightened being in the same verses is referred to as a mahabhogi, a super enjoyer. And so we might scratch our head and think, hang on, if the unenlightened person is an enjoyer, essentially because they're attached to pleasure, how can the enlightened being be considered a super enjoyer? Doesn't that mean they're super unenlightened? And what it's pointing at is this point, is that once the attachment has been broken, so the bogey, the unenlightened person, it's really their attachment to pleasure. So an enjoyer who is attached to pleasure is what creates the suffering. So for the liberated person, the non-attachment means that they get to fully enjoy the pleasure, and so then they're referred to a mahabhogi, a super enjoyer, but in a different context to the attachment enjoyment.
So is there, if, let's say I'm still very attached to certain things, which I am, looking at it, is it just looking at that and seeing how I suffer when I fear losing it? Is it just looking at it over and over again that eventually allows it to fall away? Or do some people just get hit with that? Or
I think that getting hit with it, when we really look at it, is the culmination of a investigation process. And the culmination of it, the insight, doesn't necessarily present itself as the culmination of an investigation or contemplation. Sometimes the insight seems completely devoid from any intellectualizing. And because that's how it presents, often the appreciation that it's part of a cause and effect process is not seen. And in that moment of insight, it sort of seems like it's completely not conceptual. It's like an aha moment that informs us, but not through the intellect. However, that final slipping into place is because I would say often, which we don't appreciate, is that there is a whole lot of pointing, a whole lot of thinking, a whole lot of seeing bits and pieces from your own experiences that are all delivering little bits to the piece, and then in the end it clicks into place, and we really register the click into place. That's the significant thing. But it's preceded by a lot of contemplation and little insights and things like that. So that's why the framework is provided, and the different forms of suffering, guilt, blame, pride, worry, expectation, and the underlying ground on which those stem, the belief in personal doership and attachment to outcome, is described so that we do get to see our own internal mental movements, register them. And the more we register them and the clearer they become as being built on these foundations, the more we get to see, oh, that's another form of suffering coming in on top of another form of suffering. And at some point, the working mind that is registering all the different forms of the thinking mind starts to cut off the thinking mind. The same brain starts to see the brain's faulty programming, and it's the brain that corrects the faulty programming. So it requires essentially the working mind to understand where the brain itself, the thinking mind, is functioning incorrectly, and to see that, and then it starts self-correcting. So it's like an antivirus going to work on the virus part of the system. So all of the talk on the weekend might not seem like, in practice, it's like, oh, well, that didn't suddenly, open up the heavens and the angels didn't come down. And the good news is that something else may be put in place, like some structural framework that then gets carried with us into daily living, and the working mind starts functioning automatically. The working mind is, let's say, the part of the thinking that registers blame if it happens to someone who parks on your driveway and blocks you in, and a resistance because someone blocking you in on your driveway, that's pain in the moment. That's circumstance that's not in line with your biological preferences, therefore pain in the moment. Our attachment to pleasure will kick in, and then blame will probably kick in. And at that moment where we are blaming the person for parking in our driveway, and we see that the blame is based on seeing them as a separate individual doer that could have and should have done it differently, instead of seeing this as life unfolding exactly as it's destined to unfold. And the working mind might kick up and say, everything is happening as it's designed to happen. So that cuts off the thought that says, it should be different. He should have parked not in my driveway. So the working mind that is now being programmed is being programmed to run interference on the thinking mind that is running a story that makes no sense. And so as the working mind, as we go through daily life, starts cutting off the thinking mind, then, or running interference on the story of the thinking mind, we find that there's more peace.
Roger, most of your talks begin with what are we really looking for question. And then you present what you suggest is the answer, which is happiness, which means peace of mind. And I struggle with attachment to outcome. That's where I usually get stuck, or it seems that there's stuckness. And whenever I ask myself that question, usually I'm like, am I really looking for peace of mind? I have to be honest, like I don't think I am. I mean, I'm like, no. And your description today actually has been, there's just a slightest little difference in the depth that you described in pleasure and pain. I was sort of holding pleasure and pain as this, like, life is pleasure and pain. It's like this narrow little, and what I'm looking for is this great explosion of, right? Because that seemed like, it seems, and if I look at the movement of this body mind here, it seems that's what it's looking for, even though it knows through overwhelming evidence that that's not going to stay, that it's simply not a lasting place. And
so something deeper down doesn't know, right? When you're honest with yourself, like you're being now, and you say, if I'm frank, I find that I'm actually looking for pleasure. Or at least this notion that I say, what you're really looking for is peace of mind. And you might, I'm looking for peace of mind. And then at some point you go, actually, hang on a sec. I don't think I'm looking for peace of mind. I'm looking for bliss, let's say. Yeah. So what... it's so good. So that's why I say, actually, I should, and what you're really looking for, what we're really looking for, what humanity is really looking for, whether we realize it or not. So many people are not looking for it in practice. They're looking for pleasure. But the correction to that at some point is to realize, I'm really looking for peace of mind, but I have been seeking for pleasure. And so what you're describing is, on the one hand, you have an intellectual understanding that pleasure isn't going to deliver continuous happiness. It's going to come, it's going to go. At best, it's going to be highly pleasurable for a while. But you know from your own experience that it doesn't deliver sustainable happiness. So that's one part. And then the other part is, no, stuff that, I want pleasure. That's what will really satisfy me. So there's two things running in competition with each other. And the deepening of the understanding means the uprooting of the misunderstanding that's left in the system. And sometimes we have no idea that what this is talking about, saying that our happiness is never to be found in the flow of life, our happiness is never to be found in pleasure and pain. The working mind hasn't necessarily clicked that pleasure and pain means the most intensive pleasures, like love, that feels so deep and profound. We stick that in some holy place. That's not pleasure or pain. That's special, and that's really what I'm looking for. And when the working mind clicks and goes, that's pleasure and pain as well, that profound, all sorts of profound feelings, also pleasure or pain, but the profound good ones fit into the category of pleasure. And then it clicks, it's not to be found there either. That's what it's saying. It's not to be found in pleasure or pain. And then we realize that deep down, we're remembering that time when the Tantra weekend, let's say, or we first fell in love. It doesn't have to be Tantra. And then we're craving that. I just wish that would come back again. And we don't realize that what we're doing is we're involved in pleasure. We're hanging our hat, our happiness hat, on that feeling of having fallen in love. And it was very pleasurable, but it's not what's continuously, unbrokenly available.
It seems like it's that you have to almost have some faith that that is available on a continuous level, because, like you say, if you haven't experienced it, then how do you know it's there? I have to take Roger's word for it and say, which I believe, by the way, but I don't know. It's you know what I mean. I
Sure. Well, all this talk is not. Well, the hope is that it starts translating into a practical shift from suffering into peace. Now, not necessarily on a continuous, unbroken basis to start with, but just a shifting out of suffering into the relief of suffering. And that's peace of mind. And so the continuous, unbroken means when it stops shifting back into suffering and we find ourselves always at peace. And so then that, as you say, if we don't know it as continuous and unbroken, an investigation of the peace that happens from time to time can start to give us at least an intellectual understanding how the continuous unbroken version of it can be there, especially if we see that the suffering is something that comes in and covers up that peace. And then we see, the continuous unbroken is simply the background of who we are in daily life, and it just gets covered up by blobs of blame and guilt. And as those blobs of blame and guilt start getting cut off where previously they didn't, and what's revealed is, I forgot my friend was doing what was destined to happen when he did that to me. And if I see life as destiny unfolding, and so in the moment when pain is delivered to me, I see it as my destiny that pain is delivered, and the destiny of my friend to be the instrument through which that pain is delivered. Then my attitude to my friend is not, you did this to me, I hate you, but rather our life is unfolding as it's destined, and it was my destiny in this moment to be hurt. If suffering arises, then there'll either be the recognition or not the recognition that is destiny for suffering to also arise as a result of my genes and up-to-date conditioning or the cosmic law.
So in this afternoon session, I've had a headache the whole time, and I don't get headaches very often. And so I'm objecting to this headache, and it feels like suffering. And so as you're talking, I'm trying to think, okay, how can I not be suffering with this headache? I'm not finding any good solutions to it. Do you have any thoughts?
Well, is it clear that the headache is pain in the moment?
Yes.
Is it clear that the commentary about the pain in the moment not being there or being there is the additional load of suffering?
Yes.
On top of the pain?
Right.
Is it clear that you're not the doer?
Well, let's see. I don't know if that's clear.
Okay. You're not the doer of the headache, right? You didn't create the headache.
I can't see how I did, although it could be, there is that layer of guilt that says, well, it's your fault, but I don't see how I created it.
But that level of guilt is not the headache itself. That's the suffering, right?
Oh, that's on top of it, right?
Yeah. So at least the headache is not your doing. It's a biological movement. Like if you have a heart attack, God forbid, it's not your doing. You didn't create it. It was just, the time when the hardware gave up. And so the headache is, all these factors that we don't control, and it produces a headache. So that's not your doing. And that's pain. It's clear that the suffering is a layer on top of the pain, which is making the situation even worse. With a bit of investigation, we'll see that the suffering is also something that is being inspired by the pain that you didn't create. So it's a follow-on to the pain that you didn't create. And when we look at it, we see that it's a follow-on or a movement based on your genes and up-to-date conditioning. So it might seem like you are doing the suffering, but it's just happening, just like the headache is happening. So that's an explanation of what's happening. And there isn't an explanation that says how to stop it, because then I'd be talking to a doer, telling them to do something that they're not in control of. Just the explanation of dynamics. If that becomes understood by the working mind, which it is because of the questions you've asked in the past, shows that there is an understanding, although that understanding tends to come and go in the flip-flopping phase. So just the explanation of the dynamics creates more potentiality that dynamic is, the dynamic of doership is going to get cut off. Not by a doer, but just by the realization, oh, the headache is there, and my resisting it is just making the situation worse. Not the doer saying I should stop, it's the understanding that just pops up and says, that sees it for what it is. And then it either gets cut off or it doesn't. And if it doesn't get cut off, if we say, oh, I better recognize this a bit more deeply than I did, then that's the doer coming in and trying to control the situation. If it doesn't get cut off, it's like, oh, well, it must be destiny for me not only to have a headache, but for there to be a layer of resistance as well.
So would you make a distinction between pain and suffering, or is it possible to have pain without it just in the nature of pain being suffering, not even with layers on top of it?
Yeah, so I would make a very strong distinction that the way the words are being used in the teaching is that there is pleasure and pain, and that has nothing whatsoever to do with suffering. Okay. So if your thumb was placed in a vice and I started twisting it and there's pain, in the context of this teaching, that pain has nothing to do with suffering. So in the English language, we can either say, oh, I had to suffer the pain. So let's be clear that suffering is reserved not for the pain of having your thumb squeezed, but of the mental movement that is layered on top, that is a commentary about the circumstance that's happening. And that commentary would include, let's say, hatred for me as the one inflicting the pain on you. Plus a commentary about how life should be different or could be different from what it is. So that layer of psychological commentary is the suffering about the pain, meaning our attitude to the pain. And if we're not clear on this, and one of the things is that before we start doing these investigations, before we start pulling the landscape of our daily life apart and starting to see things more clearly, which includes labeling. So in this case, labeling is not such a bad thing. Often we think labeling is the problem. Labeling is a problem when we label something as pleasure or pain, and then the attachment to pleasure and pain happens. This sort of labeling is just calling a spade, meaning, that's a chair, that's a table, that's a person, no attachment to it. We can even label something as pleasure and pain if we're just being objective about things. Before we start being equipped in a way that allows us to dissect the experience, to come to understand it better, there's no cognition, no awareness of the difference between pleasure and pain and suffering, because they arise simultaneous to each other and they're all mixed in together. And so all we get is this big mix of blah. and so we don't know what's going on inside. So the coming to see the conceptual separation is very important. So A Course in Miracles, a teaching, a methodology, has a lesson in it. One of the lessons is circumstance is not in your control. I'm not paraphrasing, I'm not saying it word for word, but something like circumstance or what happens in life is not in your control. Your attitude, however, to what happens is in your control. And so that lesson, why is the lesson being presented? It's being presented to create a conceptual distinction between the circumstance and one's attitude to the circumstance. It's saying, okay, circumstance you're not in control of. Attitude, on the other hand, you are in control of. And so if someone is practicing that lesson, is reading the description and then starting to look for themselves in their own daily life for that week, how there is circumstance and an attitude. It could be the first time that we realize, wow, my attitude to the circumstance or my attitude to the headache is very different from the headache itself. Something that we might never have seen before. Anyway, further down in the course, which is a teaching methodology, there's another lesson. And the other lesson says, oh, by the way, even your attitude is not in your control. Because now it's created this, at first it created the distinction between circumstance and attitude. That was the job that needed to be done then. And it seems like we're in control of our attitude. Because of new conditioning that comes in, we find our attitude changes. And it seems like I am changing my attitude rather than realizing new information has come in, which then automatically changes my attitude. So, for example, we get told, why don't you look on the bright side of things instead of always looking on the negative side of things? That's your attitude to circumstance. And you're in control of your attitude to circumstance, is what we might be told. And then we start practicing. We see that, oh, we have a negative attitude to this. And then something comes in, no, change your attitude. And we find that our attitude starts to become more positive, let's say. And it seems like, oh, I changed my attitude from negative to positive. Actually, it was a result of new conditioning coming in that said there's an alternative to a negative attitude, there's a positive attitude. And that change happened through that particular methodology. And then at some point down the track, it's not so much it's not so much the purpose of the lesson to distinguish between circumstance and attitude. It becomes a new purpose. The new purpose is to say, oh, even your attitude is a happening and not your doing. So you can surrender to your blame if blame happens. Blame is attitudinal and it's not your doing. And so if it happens, relax. It's a happening. So there we have it.
So I think this falls in the category of attitudinal, but I've heard you say many times here and in the recordings, when you spoke about the friend who has hurt you, and your friend hurt you because that's how they were destined in that moment. And I guess what comes up for me, not maybe in that moment of feeling hurt by the friend, because experiencing the hurt, but that the friend, just like I feel like, same as for this fellow's headache, was actually giving a gift like this fellow's headache gave him a gift of getting a deeper glimpse of the teachings, and the friend who hurt me let me see my doership attitude about being hurt, so giving a gift. I just wondered if you had any comments about that.
Yeah, well, if that becomes, let's say, a story that runs interference on suffering, so without that interpretation, then let's say suffering would happen. And if you start seeing these things as positives instead of just seeing the negative aspect of them, then that can run interference on the story that's creating suffering. If the suffering falls away, then if the tendency for the suffering coming up falls away, we might not even need that additional story to run interference on the suffering. And so it might arise sometimes that because, the fact is that if someone wipes out your bank account, as happened with Leonard Cohen, he used to come and visit Ramesh, and one time he rang Ramesh up because he had given him a blank check in case he needed to use it for anything, some emergencies or something. And he said, hey, I think you should tear that check up because my assistant has wiped me out of everything I have. And in that situation, I mean, for example, I'm sure it like the great little parable of the Chinese farmer who had one thing after another turn out bad, and his neighbors were very sad for him, and he just kept saying maybe, and what looked like a bad outcome turned into be a blessing. And so each time they said, oh, we're so sorry for you, he was maybe. So there's a great wisdom in that attitude, saying, I don't know what this really is going to deliver beyond this point. So I don't know means let me not hang on to the interpretation of it just as it is now, which is very negative. But at the same time, we don't necessarily want to go around pulling the wool over our eyes to some extent and making something that's not good into something good. Unless doing that is cutting off some suffering. If the attachment to outcome falls away, I can say that this is not a good situation. This is bad relative to a certain benchmark. So if I say, relative to my preference, what my friend has done is bad. It's pain. As long as I know it's relative to a certain benchmark, let's say my biological preference, or relative to the benchmark of how friends should treat each other, then I can say this clearly is not good, but it doesn't mean that suffering arises. If a deeper understanding is there that says, but I understand what has happened here is not good. I'm sure we understand. I used to go around at one phase, which is the phase of cutting off attachment, saying, oh, it's all good. Anything that happened, I would receive it with, it's all good. And that's on an attitudinal level, in a sense, where we start to realize, well, it is what it is, and it's not as bad as my mind previously would have made it out to be. So someone says, oh, I'm so sorry for being late. Oh, it's all good. I'm so sorry for having stolen your stuff. Oh, it's all good. And it clicked at one point. I go, it's not all good. Really, starving children in the world, it's all good. No, some things that we have to be able to then come back and say, no, that's good, or that's pleasurable, and that's not good, that's not pleasurable. So we can start to come back and be realistic on an assessment of... Well, depending on the particular circumstance. So good relative to my biological preferences. So chocolate cake is good relative to my biological preferences, and therefore the chocolate cake is pleasurable. Because it's something very relative to biological preferences. Seeing tragedies happen, relative to the families, you'd say that's not good. Relative to the overall movement of life environment, that might be very useful, like bushfires, forest fires. Relative to the houses that got burnt, it's not good. Relative to the overall ecology, it may serve a purpose. So instead of becoming highly fixated with a particular benchmark and saying it's not good and that's it, we can see our relative to different benchmarks, it's different things, good or bad, or pleasurable or painful. As long as we don't hold the benchmark that says this defines who I am, that's the problematic benchmark, where we have this in the ground and saying relative to who I am, this is good or bad. If that is the case, then that's suffering. So I found that being able to call something pleasurable or painful, good or bad, and yet then not find myself dragged into suffering, was a real integration. I didn't have to then sugarcoat the circumstance and say it's all good. And that, I think, is part of the integration process. Doug, can you pass that? Yeah.
I actually wasn't suggesting sugarcoating. There have been times when something's come up and it's felt like tremendous suffering. And so there would be something to get me through it attitudinally, but still staying with the suffering. But I've realized I can't think of an exception, and I'm not talking about horrible things happening to others. I'm only speaking about in my life experience. But I can't really think of an exception where life was actually giving a gift, and if I would just open to see it, usually it's not like the kind of gift that I want to receive until I really embrace it like that, and then I say, oh, that was a gift. And I can't think of an exception to that. Mm-hmm. And the other thing, outcomes, and I know what is meant by outcomes, but every time I hear the word outcomes, it's almost like in my mind I get like a photograph. So a photograph, this is an outcome, but a photograph is like that moment. So there's really not really outcomes, although I know exactly what is meant by outcomes.
Yeah, they're momentary outcomes that then change into a new outcome. So the outcome is always changing, essentially. But, at the point when your name is drawn from the hat, and it's the winner of the $10,000 prize is Prudence. In that moment, there's an outcome. You've won the money, and then the money gets spent or gets lost, and it turns into a new outcome. Yeah, it's a fake lotto kiosk.
And if I stole your chocolate cake, maybe I saw someone poison it. So maybe anyway.
Yeah. But I wouldn't mind talking more, because this point about it's a real subtlety, because it's one of the awakening factors, one of the big significant factors, is where we're told there is no such thing as pleasure and pain. It's a huge movement that delivers so much value, because we're so used to being attached, or we're designed to be attached to pleasure and pain. And so whenever we label something as pleasure or pain, our attachment to pleasure kicks in. And so one of the awareness teachings is to say, actually, there is no such thing as pleasure or pain. There's just what is. And it serves a great purpose to quieten an aspect of the thinking mind that is always judging and labeling, to quieten that down, to start. And so then the "it's all good" becomes sort of like a movement that is, so you could change it from "it's all good" to just "it is," or "it is what it is." And I'm sure many of us have found that "it is what it is a phase that happens, or something that stays longer than what we would call a phase. And it's really reassuring, and not only reassuring, but relieving when we find ourselves confronting a challenging situation, and internally this reminder comes up, oh, it is what it is. It becomes a prompt to drop us back into a place of non-involvement in attitudinally, non-involvement in circumstance, and drops us back to seeing things with more perspective. And what you mentioned, seeing the gift in things, also does that. It brings us back to a position of not defining it so radically, or at least even defining it in the opposite direction and say, actually, this is probably going to be very positive. So it creates a non-involvement in the initial story that we're used to having, and gives perspective. And the argument, or not an argument, because as you know, I think teachings support each other, and so when I talk about a different teaching, it's not about a criticism for another teaching, it's about highlighting why it says certain things, because I now think that we're at a point where humans will benefit a lot from understanding what a teaching does, how they work on us. Because one of the things is we have become a little over-identified with teachings as truth rather than a methodology that brings about change. So to understand, and a lot of teachings don't tell us that they are a methodology just bringing about change, because that might diminish the efficacy of the teaching. So they just tell us stuff which is designed to bring about change, and then another teaching needs to clean up afterwards. But that's fine, because that's what the other teaching says, okay, that's what my role is. And it doesn't get angry that, oh, look at the mess you made. It's not really a mess, it's like remodeling a house, you have to make a mess to bring about the change. So the assertion is that the pleasure and pain is a label that we put onto the circumstance, and it doesn't exist other than the label that we layer on top of it. Whereas when we come to the actual experience itself, there's a component of the experience, part of the biological structure of the human being, that isn't psychological. So when we really come to the experience in the moment, we find that pleasure and pain isn't just a label, but it's intrinsic in the experience itself. So the hammer, hit your thumb with a hammer, and there is a sensation that is pain relative to the biological aspects of the body. Microphone, just can we pass it back there for now?
Hello. A few months ago, I was watching a YouTube, and I've been with my partner watching several YouTubes, and I've really found so many handy and insightful. The one I wanted to just check in with you about now was that at one point there was a discussion, and your mind or your intuition came up with "stop," and I'm like, I love that. I'm tired. There's so many things to compare to. You haven't written a book yet. So I'm really wishing and hoping that, I can progress after that. That's what allows me to step back and relax, and then I can allow my intuition to flower and to open up, and to either just drop it right there or stop is like a miracle.
Mm-hmm. So actually, all the talking, all the explanations, are just so that we can stop.
Yes.
It's giving equipment to the working mind to stop the mid-sentence. It's the thing that comes in and cuts the thinking mind off, and then we just be.
I have a part two on that though.
Mm-hmm.
My part, the light goes on. Is that right? Yeah, because the light is on. Okay. No, the stop thing is some kind of a powerful mantra or something. There's something behind it.
Mm-hmm.
When you or I say it, stop. I mean, you can hear a pin drop. There's just something about that word. Sorry, I had to say that.
Yeah, but you'd find actually, it might be the case for you, and that's great if it is. But it's not a standard thing, because stop becomes powerful only once our system understands what stop means. Because if the doer is just saying stop to the thinking, but it doesn't understand why stopping makes sense, then because the word stop really is just a reminder. It's like a bookend to the thinking that's been happening. Like, why has this person done this to me? This is just not fair. Stop. Mm-hmm. But it's really important that I tell you why. Can you believe what stop? No, but just stop. It's really...
If you had my brain, you would like stop. Mm-hmm. Because I need that. That's the space that I'm needing.
Yeah, but you see, it's creating a stop for you, right?
Yes.
So in the example that I'm using, it's creating a stop also. Mm-hmm. It's serving its purpose. But if I give it to a certain makeup, if someone hears stop, their mind will be going, but this person did this, stop. But and there's no cutting off. It's no the cutting off. So if stop works for you, my point is that something deep down in your system understands, this is what it's all about. And I got lost for a second in the story about what it's all about, which is not what it's all about. And so it's just reminding us to come back to So if stop works for you, that's great. Yeah.
Is it still on? I have a question. I might cry when I ask this.
It's okay.
I found, I had 7 years ago, my daughter died in a really bad wreck. And I have got to go back and forth between acceptance. For me, my question to you is, I find that I too have found many gifts that have happened since. One is this journey that I'm having now. But what's so hard, and my question to you is, the grief that's there, how do you finally, it's like pockets of it. And so what do you do with that energy? I know you're talking about this flow, but it's like there's just something stuck.
Mm-hmm.
And so how do you move that?
It comes up on its own when the blocks to it get removed, and the process tends to remove the blocks bit by bit, otherwise it could be too much. And so there are certain words around this releasing that can become supportive of that energy coming up. One, it won't kill you. The feeling is a feeling that says, this is going to kill me. This feeling is going to kill me.
Yeah.
That the hallmark of suffering is that it contains in it a story that feels very, very real, and at the core of the story, this is going to kill me. And if we're fortunate and that energy comes up in little bits or and we realize it didn't kill me, that really allowing it to come to the surface, which is counterintuitive, because when it's screaming out, this is going to kill you, what we do is distract ourselves, push it down, and not want to face it. And if it didn't serve a purpose of it, if it coming up didn't serve a purpose, then the fact that it's not going to kill me is irrelevant. It's like, I'd rather not feel it. Once we understand that there's a very big purpose in allowing it to come out, it empties up the system. These energies really take up space. They make us feel much more contracted than we need to be. But they're there because it's part of this experience of experiencing life. So for now it's there, but at some point the experience might become one of much more lightness and space. And in order for that to happen, this energy needs to be able to come up and come out. And so that's when it's really important, if we understand this is part of a process of there being more space, more lightness, more peace, more contentment, even in the face of the tragic situations that have happened. And you know that's possible because you experience periods of peace,
Yeah.
even given the tragedy that's happened. So the more of the grief energy that comes up and out, because grief at its core has taken this event to be an attack on who we are. So the more of that energy that comes up and out and is no longer part of the makeup, the lighter we feel. And so that's where this understanding that it won't kill me, and so therefore not only it won't kill me, but it makes sense to feel the uncomfortableness. That's where that logic kicks in, that it's a useful process for it to come up and out. If we don't have an understanding of why we're letting it come up, we won't let it come up, because it's counterintuitive to let it come up. We want to keep it down. So we need a reason to allow it to come up. The other explanation is to see that, one, the sadness is based on love. That's why the sadness is there, because there's love. And two, see in the grief that the doership attitude and the attachment, meaning the belief that somehow your completeness is dependent on that situation not having happened. As it comes up, to see those components in it, the doership and the attachment. So maybe blame towards the other driver or whatever. And see, it's not about, we sometimes hear that, or often we hear that liberation, peace is the end of blame, the end of shame, the end of wanting life to be a certain way. And so when these energies come up, they've got the complete opposite in them. They're full of blame and shame and expectation of how life is. And so we don't want a thought in the moment when it's time for these things to come up. We don't want a thought that comes in and go, oh no, this is all suffering, and let's witness it or let's cut it off. There's a time when it's not time for us to witness it. There's another time for it to be witnessed, and there's another time for it to get cut off, and there's a time for it to be felt. And so when it starts bubbling and it feels like I'm ready to feel it, collapse into it. Okay. Allow it to take you. Curl up and let it work you, which then means you need to cry, you need to...
I would say I have triggers. Like, it can even be I might see somebody's daughter, or now I have friends whose children are getting married, or I might see, her name's Emma, she was 16, and so when I see like her friends and where it's like I can be so strong, and then there's moments it's like, oh. So I love that. I mean, there are days I will just, I have my times that I do just check out and feel it. But it's like the pain is like the ocean to me. It's so great that I have to touch it and come back. And then yet in it, I think I've talked to maybe a couple of y'all here, there is, I feel Emma. And so you're so new to me, so I don't know all the teachings. But for me, she is so around. She's not gone. She is physically gone, but there is a beauty in that she is kind of like a superpower that I have. And I feel like, so in that there is great strength and hope. Mm-hmm. But there's still this peace, and you've helped me with that, of just like permission to just let it be. Mm-hmm. But like that stop, there's times I've done that stop, but I'm like, wait, I feel like it now, it needs to move.
Yeah. So each of the stopping, the releasing, or the witnessing. So stop is essentially cutting it off. Not something you do, but the understanding just pops up. The thought, in my process, it was I am, was what was the stop equivalent. Now I'm saying stop. And it just cuts off the suffering there. And then the other position is to witness suffering and find that what I am is not the suffering, and yet it carries on. And then the release is something that is not often talked about, because the focus is sometimes on witnessing. And at some point, witnessing can become a bypassing, where we're continually cutting off or not feeling and witnessing. Now that's useful to create a distance, but if it goes too far, then it becomes a dissociation, it becomes a bypassing. And that's when we start feeling, no, something's not right about not feeling this, and it'll want to come out. So just hearing an explanation that says, it's not necessarily all about witnessing it or cutting it off. And the opposite, but suppressing is something different again. Suppressing is what we used to do before any understanding came in. So suppressing, then witnessing, cutting off, and expressing is another option. And so it's not about knowing which one it is. You don't have to choose. Just feel and allow actually the body to move. As soon as the body knows that there's another option, then next week that option can start happening. And you don't know which option is more relevant in a particular moment. The body has an amazing intelligence once it's primed. And so we can trust the biological intelligence. Okay. And being strong also is not, I use that word, being strong, stoic and composed. It's actually very strong to let go.
And I have one other question. I don't know if I guess it's appropriate. Of what is your thought on camp? Because I haven't really been angry. There was something powerful that happened at the hospital where I just had the sense of, it's like I call it grace, that came over me, and I have not been angry. I have been sad. But I've wondered, you hear these stages of grief, and I've thought, well, why do I have? Is that just a fact that I have to go through a period of anger? Is that? Can you, Bob?
Usually, when energies are coming out, they either come out as anger first and then turn into sadness, or they come out as sadness first and then turn into anger. They don't really turn into anger. The anger level is revealed. And whichever one comes out second, so if it starts off as being very angry at someone and then it turns into sadness, often we haven't come in contact with that before. And we're surprised that under the anger, for example, there's a sadness. And similarly, we can be surprised that under the sadness, there is an anger. So once again, it's not for you to turn it into anger or control it. It's just allowing the process to take its time. It may not be that anger is there, but from what I've seen, the dynamic tends to be that anger and sadness are interconnected.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, we've probably... Yes, we have. There was a question here. Yeah.